The unmistakable crack of a human rib under the relentless pressure of CPR echoed through the pristine marble lobby of the hospital's VIP wing. Sweat stung Nurse Chloe Montgomery's eyes as she drove her locked elbows down again and again. Above her, the hospital's newly appointed CEO sneered, his tailored suit a stark contrast to the life-or-death struggle on the floor. "Stop this barbaric display immediately! You are making a scene in front of the board," he barked, his face flushed with corporate rage. "Get your hands off that vagrant! You're fired, nurse!" But Chloe didn't stop. She couldn't, because she knew something the arrogant CEO didn't. The man dying beneath her hands wasn't a vagrant. He was an active-duty Navy SEAL, and the men coming to claim him were about to turn this hospital upside down. Chloe Montgomery was not a stranger to the scent of blood, the frantic beeping of a Zoll defibrillator, or the heavy metallic smell of sheer panic. Before taking her position as the senior charge nurse at the ultra-exclusive Belmont Presbyterian Medical Center in Chicago, she had spent 6 years as a trauma specialist at Walter Reed National Military Medical Center. She had pulled shrapnel from young men who looked like they should still be in high school, and had held the hands of hardened veterans as they took their last, shuddering breaths. She was a professional forged in the fires of real, unadulterated trauma, but Belmont Presbyterian was a different world entirely. Here, the floors of the newly christened Sterling Wing were polished Italian marble. The artwork on the walls cost more than the state-of-the-art MRI machines down the hall, and the patients were politicians, hedge fund managers, and tech billionaires who expected their medical care to come with a side of caviar and obsequious deference. It was a Tuesday morning, precisely 9:14 a.m. Chloe was at the Central Nurses Station, meticulously auditing the narcotics log for the 3rd time that shift. Her colleague, nurse practitioner Jessica Lewis, was quietly sipping a macchiato, complaining about the new mandatory customer service training they were all scheduled to attend. "I swear, Chloe," Jessica muttered, adjusting her perfectly pressed designer scrubs. "If they tell me one more time that I need to smile through the pain when a senator's wife demands dilaudid for a hangnail, I am going to walk into oncoming traffic." Chloe offered a tired smile, her eyes never leaving the digital chart in front of her. "Just keep your head down, Jess. We're here to save lives, even if they are heavily insured, highly irritating lives." Just then, the heavy, soundproof glass doors of the VIP lobby slid open. A man staggered through. He didn't belong in the Sterling Wing. He was dressed in faded, dirt-smudged denim and a heavy, olive-drab canvas jacket that looked like it had seen multiple winters in a trench. He was heavily built, broad-shouldered, with a thick, unkempt beard and a faded baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. His breathing was ragged, a wet, guttural sound that instantly made the hair on the back of Chloe's neck stand up. It was the sound of a failing airway. The receptionist, a young woman named Brittany, who had been hired more for her pageant-winning smile than her crisis management skills, immediately stood up, looking alarmed. "Excuse me, sir. Sir, the free clinic is across the street. You can't be in here." The man didn't answer. He took 2 more heavy, uncoordinated steps towards the reception desk. His right hand clutched his chest, his knuckles white. Then his eyes rolled back, exposing the whites, and he collapsed. He didn't just fall. He went down like a felled redwood. The sickening thud of his skull hitting the Italian marble reverberated through the vast, quiet lobby. "Code Blue! Lobby!" Chloe screamed, her voice cutting through the hushed ambience like a siren. She was already moving, vaulting over the low, modern barrier of the nurses' station before the words had fully left her mouth. She didn't wait for the overhead page. She didn't wait for permission. The Walter Reed instincts kicked in, overriding the Belmont Presbyterian protocols of call a porter and maintain decorum. She slid to her knees beside the massive man. Up close, he smelled of sweat, stale coffee, and something metallic, like gun oil. She immediately checked for a carotid pulse, her 2 fingers pressing firmly against the thick, corded muscle of his neck. Nothing. Not a flutter. Not a thready beat. Absolute silence. His face was rapidly turning an alarming shade of cyanotic blue, the oxygen starvation already taking a massive toll. "Jess, bring the crash cart! Now! Page Dr. Hayes to the lobby!" Chloe roared, interlacing her fingers and placing the heel of her hand dead center on the man's sternum. She locked her elbows, shifted her body weight over him, and began compressions. 1, 2, 3, 4. CPR on television is a neat, tidy affair. Real CPR is violent. It is an act of sheer physical force, attempting to manually squeeze a heart between the breastbone and the spine to force blood through a dying brain. The man's chest was incredibly dense, layered with thick slabs of muscle. Chloe had to push harder than usual, throwing her entire upper body weight into every single thrust. On the third compression, she felt the sickening, distinct pop of a rib separating from the cartilage. It was a terrible sound, but a necessary evil. If you aren't breaking ribs on a man this size, you aren't pumping blood. "Come on, buddy. Stay with me," Chloe muttered through gritted teeth, sweat already beading on her forehead. 28, 29, 30. She leaned over, pinched his nose, and delivered 2 rescue breaths, watching his massive chest rise before diving straight back into compressions. Around her, the lobby had descended into hushed, horrified chaos. A wealthy donor in a Chanel suit gasped and covered her mouth, her assistant rushing to shield her eyes from the gruesome reality of a life slipping away. Jessica came sprinting around the corner, pushing the heavy red Zoll crash cart, its wheels squealing against the marble. "Pads! Get the pads on him!" Chloe ordered, not breaking her rhythm. Her triceps were burning, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps, but her rhythm was flawless. 100 beats a minute. The tempo of survival. Jessica ripped open the defibrillator pads, but as she moved to cut open the man's heavy jacket and shirt, the sliding doors of the lobby hissed open once more. A procession of people walked in. Leading them was a man whose presence immediately sucked the remaining air out of the room. Sterling Price was the newly installed Chief Executive Officer of the Belmont Presbyterian Medical Board. He was a man who viewed healthcare not as a vocation, but as a high-yield portfolio. He had made his fortune in corporate acquisitions and private equity, ruthless in his efficiency and completely devoid of clinical empathy. To Sterling Price, a hospital was a luxury hotel that happened to dispense medication. Patients were clients, doctors were service providers, and nurses were simply the janitorial staff of the human body, necessary but meant to be unseen and unheard. Today was supposed to be a triumph. Sterling was leading a tour of wealthy international investors through the newly renovated lobby, showcasing the tranquil, healing environment their millions had funded. Instead, he walked into a slaughterhouse scene. In the center of his pristine, multi-million-dollar lobby, a nurse was aggressively pummeling the chest of a filthy, bearded man. Medical wrappers were strewn across the floor. Jessica was slicing through the man's shirt with trauma shears, revealing a chest covered in faded, complex tattoos and a deep, jagged scar that looked suspiciously like a bullet wound. Sterling stopped dead in his tracks. The investors behind him murmured in shock. The serene, spa-like atmosphere was shattered by the harsh, rhythmic grunt of Chloe delivering compressions and the robotic voice of the Zoll monitor barking, "Analyzing heart rhythm. Do not touch the patient." "Clear!" Chloe shouted, throwing her hands up as Jessica hit the shock button. The man's massive frame violently bucked off the marble floor as electricity surged through his heart. He landed with a heavy slap. Chloe immediately slammed her hands back onto his chest and resumed compressions. Sterling Price's face turned a mottled, furious purple. This was a disaster. This was a PR nightmare happening in real time in front of the very people he was trying to squeeze for a $50 million endowment. "What in the name of God is going on here?" Sterling thundered, his polished leather shoes clicking sharply against the marble as he marched toward the scene. "Sir, please stand back. He's in cardiac arrest," Jessica pleaded, frantically drawing up a milligram of epinephrine into a syringe. "I don't care what he's in," Sterling snapped, waving his hand dismissively. "Look at him. He's clearly a vagrant who wandered in off the street. Why is he in the VIP pavilion? Where is security? Why hasn't he been removed to the public ER loading dock?" Chloe didn't look up. She couldn't afford to break her focus. 15, 16, 17? He collapsed here. If I stop, he dies. "Jess, push the EPI." Sterling stepped closer, invading Chloe's space, the scent of his expensive Tom Ford cologne clashing with the metallic tang of adrenaline. "You are destroying the decorum of this facility. You are traumatizing the guests. I want this man placed on a gurney and removed to the basement level immediately. If we move him without stabilizing the rhythm, he will brain death within 3 minutes," Chloe growled, her arms burning with lactic acid. "Sir, step the hell back and let me do my job." The investors gasped. A nurse had just cursed at the CEO. Sterling's eyes narrowed into dangerous slits. He was not a man who was told no, let alone by an employee. He leaned down, pointing a manicured finger inches from Chloe's face. "I am the CEO of this hospital, and you are creating a spectacle," Sterling hissed, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "Look at what you're doing to him. I heard you crack his ribs. You are using barbaric, aggressive force on a homeless man who probably overdosed, and you are doing it in front of the board. Stop these compressions right now." "He is in V-fib," Chloe yelled, her voice echoing. "He needs continuous CPR. I am not stopping. You are hurting him, and you are ruining this hospital's reputation. Stop it, or you will face immediate termination." Chloe finally looked up. Her eyes, hardened by years of watching young men bleed out in military tents, met the soft, entitled eyes of the billionaire CEO. She didn't see authority. She saw a coward in a suit. "Fire me then," Chloe spat, shifting her weight to drive down harder into the man's chest. "But I'm not letting him die on this floor to save your PR tour." Sterling stood up, his posture rigid with fury. He turned to the bewildered receptionist. "Call security. Call the police. I want this nurse physically removed from the premises immediately. And get someone to drag this corpse out of my lobby." He turned back to Chloe, his voice ringing out so everyone in the lobby could hear. "You are finished in this industry. You are fired, nurse. Step away from that man right now, or I will have you arrested for assault." The words, "You are fired," hung in the air, a chilling mandate that would have broken most staff members. Jessica froze, the empty epinephrine syringe trembling in her hand. She looked terrified, her career flashing before her eyes. But Chloe Montgomery was built from different steel. At Walter Reed, she had worked under the deafening roar of medevac helicopters and the screams of mass casualty events. A shouting CEO in a tailored suit was a nuisance, not a threat. "Jess, charge the monitor to 200 joules, Chloe commanded, her voice terrifyingly calm and steady. "Do it now." Jessica hesitated for a fraction of a second, looking at Sterling, then back to Chloe. The training won out. She reached for the dial. "Charging!" "I said stop!" Sterling roared, stepping forward and reaching out to physically grab Chloe's shoulder. It was a catastrophic mistake. Before Sterling's hand could connect, Chloe shifted her stance, broke her CPR rhythm for a half-second, and violently threw her elbow backward, swatting his hand away with the brutal efficiency of a combat medic who had dealt with panicking soldiers. "Do not touch me," Chloe warned, her voice dropping an octave, carrying a lethal edge. "Interfering with life-saving medical care is a federal offense. You touch me again, I'll drop you next to him. Clear." Sterling stumbled back, utterly humiliated and enraged. "Security!" he shrieked. The defibrillator wailed its high-pitched tone. Chloe threw her hands up. Jessica hit the button. Thump! The man's chest heaved. Chloe's eyes remained glued to the monitor. The chaotic, jagged lines of ventricular fibrillation suddenly flattened out into a terrifying straight line. A systole. Flat line. "Damn it," Chloe muttered. "He's gone flat. give me another milligram of EPI. I'm getting back on the chest." She slammed her hands down and resumed the grueling work. Her muscles screamed in protest. She had been doing high-quality compressions for almost 6 minutes straight, an exhausting feat for anyone. From down the hall, the heavy thud of tactical boots echoed. 3 hospital security guards, led by a burly supervisor named Miller, sprinted into the lobby. "Miller, get her off of him!" Sterling commanded, pointing a shaking finger at Chloe. "She has been terminated. She is assaulting a patient. Remove her from the building." Miller, a former cop who usually dealt with unruly drunk patients, looked at the scene in utter confusion. He saw the CEO screaming, but he also saw a highly respected trauma nurse fighting desperately to save a man's life. "Mr. Price, she's doing CPR." Miller started hesitantly. "I don't care what she's doing. She is trespassing. Pull her off." Miller stepped forward, placing a heavy hand on Chloe's shoulder. "Chloe, come on. You gotta stop. The boss is calling it." "Miller, if you pull me off this chest, you are an accessory to manslaughter," Chloe gasped, not breaking her rhythm. "He is viable. I just need a minute. I just need—" Suddenly, Dr. Nathaniel Hayes, the head of emergency medicine, burst through the sliding doors, his white coat flapping behind him. He took one look at the scene, the fired nurse, the screaming CEO, the dying man, and the security guards closing in. "What is going on here?" Dr. Hayes demanded, dropping to his knees opposite Chloe. He looked at the monitor. "He's asystolic. How long?" 6 minutes. Downtime unknown," Chloe panted. "2 shocks, 1 EPI in. You need to step away, Dr. Hayes," Sterling intervened. "This woman is fired. Let the man pass. We are not turning this lobby into an operating theater for a homeless drug addict. Doctor." Hayes looked at Sterling with pure disgust. Then he looked down at the patient. His eyes caught something glinting under the harsh fluorescent lights. When Jessica had cut the man's shirt open, a heavy silver chain had spilled out from beneath the fabric, previously hidden by his thick beard. Hanging from the chain were 2 heavily scuffed metallic rectangles. Dog tags. But it wasn't just the dog tags that caught the doctor's eye. It was the tattoo resting directly over the man's heart, right where Chloe was pounding. It was a massive, intricately detailed golden eagle clutching a trident and an anchor, the seal trident, the Budweiser. Dr. Hayes reached out and flipped one of the dog tags over, reading the stamped metal. His face went pale. "Mr. Price," Dr. Hayes said softly, his voice trembling slightly. "This isn't a homeless man." "I don't care who he is," Sterling yelled, pulling out his cell phone to dial 911 for the police. "I want her out. Look at the monitor." Jessica suddenly screamed. Chloe didn't stop, but she glanced up. The flat line on the screen had twitched. Then it spiked. A beautifully sharp, narrow QRS complex. Then another. Then a steady, rhythmic wave. Normal sinus rhythm. Chloe stopped compressions, her hands hovering over his bruised chest. She reached up and pressed her fingers against his carotid artery. The pulse was there. It was fast, bounding, and incredibly strong. "I've got a pulse," Chloe breathed, falling back onto her heels, utterly exhausted. "He's back! Get a stretcher! Now!" Dr. Hayes yelled at the security guards, who finally snapped out of their stupor and ran to help. Sterling Price, refusing to accept defeat, marched forward. "Fine, you revived him. Now put him in a service elevator and get him out of my sight. And you," he glared at Chloe, "pack your locker. The police are on their way to escort you out." Before Chloe could muster the breath to tell him exactly where he could shove his severance package, a profound, heavy vibration shook the thick glass of the lobby windows. Outside the hospital, 3 massive, black, armored Chevrolet Suburbans with government license plates aggressively jumped the curb, screeching to a halt directly in the ambulance bay, blocking it entirely. The doors flew open, and heavily armed men in tactical gear began pouring out. The heavy soundproof glass of the Belmont Presbyterian VIP lobby practically bowed inward under the sheer acoustic force of the screeching tires outside. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the wealthy patrons, the stunned security guards, and the furious CEO watched as the 3 black Chevrolet Suburbans locked down the entrance. They didn't park. They established a perimeter. Before the vehicles had even fully settled on their suspension, the doors burst open. 7 men flooded out. They weren't wearing the neat, pressed uniforms of local law enforcement. They were clad in muted tactical gear, plate carriers, drop-leg holsters, and communications earpieces. They moved with a terrifying, synchronized fluidity that spoke of thousands of hours of close-quarters combat training. They didn't walk. They flowed towards the hospital entrance like a dark, inevitable tide. Leading them was a man who looked like he had been carved out of granite. Commander Jonathan Croft possessed a face that belonged on a Roman coin, sharp, unforgiving, and deeply scarred. His eyes, a pale, icy blue, scanned the chaotic lobby through the glass before the automatic doors hissed open. "Secure the exits. Nobody leaves. Comms check," Commander Croft ordered into his lapel microphone, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that instantly dominated the cavernous room. 2 of the operators immediately flanked the main doors, their hands resting casually but purposefully on the grips of their sidearms. The investors and board members who had been touring the facility with sterling price shrank back against the marble walls, their earlier complaints about the disruption evaporating into pure, unadulterated fear. Sterling Price, however, had never been in a war zone. He had spent his life in boardrooms where his word was law and his wealth was his armor. His face, still flushed from his screaming match with Chloe, twisted into a mask of indignant outrage. "What is the meaning of this?" Sterling bellowed, stepping directly into the path of Commander Croft. "This is a private, ultra-exclusive medical facility. You cannot just storm in here like thugs. I am the CEO, and I demand to know who you are before I have my security detail remove you." Commander Croft didn't even slow down. He didn't blink. He simply kept walking, closing the distance until he was inches from Sterling's chest. The commander was a full head taller, and the sheer physical menace radiating from him forced the CEO to take a reflexive, stumbling step backward. "I am Commander Jonathan Croft, United States Navy," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet register that carried perfectly across the silent lobby. "And if you or your rent-a-cops interfere with me for even a fraction of a second, I will have you detained under federal authority so fast your head will spin. Move." He didn't wait for Sterling to comply. Croft bypassed the sputtering CEO, his eyes locking onto the center of the lobby. There, kneeling in a pool of sweat, medical wrappers, and discarded trauma shears, was Nurse Chloe Montgomery. Her hands were still resting on the chest of the massive, unconscious man. The Zoll monitor beeped steadily now, broadcasting a strong, regular heartbeat that echoed through the room. Croft knelt beside Chloe. The icy demeanor melted for a fraction of a second, replaced by a look of profound relief. He reached out and touched the unconscious man's shoulder. "Grizzly, you stubborn son of a bitch," Croft murmured. He looked up at Chloe, taking in her disheveled appearance, the tremor in her exhausted arms, and the fierce, protective glare in her eyes. "Status, nurse? Patient suffered sudden cardiac arrest. Asystole for approximately 6 minutes," Chloe rattled off, her clinical training overriding her adrenaline. "Initiated high-quality CPR. Administered 2 rounds of epinephrine, 2 shocks at 200 joules. We achieved return of spontaneous circulation 3 minutes ago. Pulse is strong, but he is unresponsive. Glasgow coma scale is a 3. He needs intubation and a trauma bay immediately." Croft nodded, his eyes scanning the broken ribs protruding slightly under the man's battered skin. "You broke his ribs?" "I saved his life," Chloe fired back, her chin jutting out defiantly. "He's built like a brick wall. The compressions had to be deep." A ghost of a smile touched Croft's lips. "I know. He's Chief Petty Officer Thomas Callahan, SEAL Team 6, and you did exactly what you had to do." Croft turned his head over his shoulder. "Medic! Get up here!" One of the men from the Suburban sprinted forward, carrying a massive olive-drab medical ruck. He immediately dropped beside Thomas and began unpacking specialized gear that far exceeded the standard hospital crash cart. "Hold on just a damn minute." Sterling Price's voice cracked like a whip across the lobby. He had finally recovered his voice, his ego refusing to let this military intrusion stand. He pointed an accusatory finger at Chloe. "I don't care if he's the Pope. That woman is no longer an employee of this hospital. I fired her for assaulting a patient and creating a public disturbance. She is trespassing, and the local police are on their way right now to arrest her." Croft slowly stood up. The air in the lobby seemed to drop 10 degrees. He turned to fully face the furious CEO. "You fired her," Croft repeated flatly. "I terminated her with extreme prejudice," Sterling spat, adjusting his suit jacket, trying to regain a semblance of authority in front of his horrified investors. "She was brutally pounding on a man who clearly didn't belong in our VIP wing. It was a PR disaster. I ordered her to stop, and she physically assaulted me and defied a direct command." "She defied your command to stop CPR on a dying man?" Croft asked, taking a slow, deliberate step toward Sterling. "He was dead," Sterling argued, his voice pitching higher. "He was flatlining, and she kept breaking his bones and causing a scene. It is against Belmont Presbyterian policy to—" "Policy?" Croft interrupted, the word slicing through the air like a scalpel. He gestured down to the unconscious SEAL. "That man has 3 Purple Hearts. 2 weeks ago, he was exposed to an experimental, classified neurotoxin during an extraction in a hostile territory. The DoD doctors thought they had cleared it from his system, but he went AWOL from the base hospital this morning. The toxin causes delayed, massive myocardial infarctions." Croft stepped closer, until Sterling's back was literally pressed against the marble reception desk. "If this nurse had listened to your policy, my chief would be lying in a morgue right now," Croft said softly. "She didn't assault him. She dragged him back from the grave." The wail of police sirens finally pierced the tense standoff in the lobby. 2 standard Chicago PD cruisers pulled up behind the imposing line of black Suburbans. 4 officers jogged into the lobby, their hands resting on their utility belts, clearly confused by the tactical lockdown they had just walked into. "Who called 911? The lead officer, a seasoned sergeant named O'Malley, barked out. "I did!" Sterling Price practically leaped forward, pointing frantically at Chloe, who was currently helping the Navy medic secure a King Airway tube down Thomas Callahan's throat. "Sergeant, I am the CEO of this hospital. I want that woman arrested immediately. She assaulted me, she assaulted a patient, and she is refusing to leave the premises after being terminated." Sergeant O'Malley looked at the scene. The tactical operators, the unconscious man on the floor, the exhausted nurse, and the frantic billionaire. He walked over to Commander Croft. "Sergeant O'Malley, CPD. What's the situation here, Commander?" Before Croft could answer, Sterling interjected. "The situation is that I am pressing charges. Arrest her. Mr. Price, I suggest you shut your mouth before I arrest you for interfering with a federal operation," Croft said, not even looking at the CEO. He handed Sergeant O'Malley a sleek, black leather credential case. O'Malley opened it, read the ID, and his eyes widened. He immediately handed it back with a respectful nod. "Sergeant O'Malley," Croft said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "My team is currently securing a high-value military asset who suffered a medical emergency. Nurse Montgomery here is the only reason he is breathing. She is operating under the protection of the United States Navy until my man is stabilized and extracted." "This is outrageous!" Sterling screamed, his face a terrifying shade of crimson. "This is a private hospital. You do not have jurisdiction here. I will call the governor. I will have all of your badges. O'Malley, do your job and arrest her." O'Malley looked at Sterling with a mixture of pity and contempt. "Mr. Price, with all due respect, I'm not touching a federal medical scene. And frankly, if she just did CPR, that's covered under the Good Samaritan law anyway. I ain't arresting a nurse for doing her job. She is not a nurse here anymore, Sterling raged, turning to Dr. Hayes, who had been quietly monitoring Thomas's vitals alongside Chloe. Dr. Hayes, tell them she is fired and needs to be removed. Dr. Hayes slowly stood up, wiping a streak of the SEAL's blood from his own wrist. He looked at the CEO, then at the stunned investors who were watching Sterling's complete meltdown. Actually, Sterling, Dr. Hayes said, his voice surprisingly steady, I am the Chief of Medicine. Under the hospital's bylaws, clinical terminations require the signature of both the CEO and the Chief Medical Officer. I'm not signing a damn thing. A collective gasp echoed from the nursing station where Jessica and the other staff had gathered to watch the drama unfold. Sterling looked like he had been struck by lightning. You are insubordinate. I'll fire you too. I'll clear out the whole department. Whoa. Commander Croft finally turned his full, terrifying attention back to Sterling Price. The military man reached into his tactical vest and pulled out a ruggedized smartphone. Mr. Price, you seem very concerned about the reputation and the finances of this hospital, Croft said slowly. Belmont Presbyterian. A non-profit, right? But heavily subsidized by federal grants. Sterling narrowed his eyes. What are you talking about? I'm talking about the $45 million Department of Defense Trauma Research Grant this hospital received last quarter, Croft said smoothly, reading off his phone screen. Grants that require strict adherence to federal trauma protocols, protocols which mandate uninterrupted emergency care. Care that you on camera, Croft pointed up at the sleek security cameras nestled in the marble ceiling, just attempted to physically halt to save face during a VIP tour. Sterling swallowed hard. The color began to drain from his face. The investors behind him were suddenly whispering fiercely amongst themselves. I was unaware of his veteran status, Sterling stammered, his bravado finally cracking under the realization of what he had done. I thought he was a vagrant. You thought he was poor, Chloe said. She stood up, wiping her sweaty forehead with the back of her arm. She walked directly up to the CEO, ignoring the wealth and power that usually shielded him from consequence. You thought he had no money, no insurance, and no value, so you decided his life wasn't worth the dirty marble he fell on. She pointed down at the massive SEAL, whose chest was rising and falling steadily under the watchful eye of the Navy medic. He took a bullet for this country, Chloe said, her voice trembling with raw, righteous anger. He took a neurotoxin for this country, and you couldn't even take a delayed tour for him. You disgust me. Sterling opened his mouth to reply, but the words died in his throat. The board members, the very people he had been trying to impress, were looking at him with utter revulsion. Commander, the Navy medic called out. Airway is secured. Vitals are stabilizing, but his BP is soft. We need to move him to the Safe House Medical Facility now. Croft nodded. Get the stretcher. We roll in too. Croft turned back to Chloe. He reached out and gently grasped her shoulder, the gesture a stark contrast to his earlier intimidation of the CEO. Nurse Montgomery, Croft said, his eyes reflecting a deep, unshakable respect. What you did today, standing your ground against him, he jerked his head towards the silent CEO, and fighting for Grizzly when he couldn't fight for himself. That's the highest tradition of service. The Navy owes you a debt. I just did my job, Commander, Chloe replied quietly, the adrenaline finally beginning to crash, leaving her limbs feeling like lead. No, Croft corrected her. You did more than that. If you ever decide you're tired of working for cowards in suits, Walter Reed always needs charge nurses with a spine. You have my number. He handed her a small, matte black challenge coin with the SEAL trident etched into the heavy metal. As the tactical team smoothly lifted the stretcher and began to roll Thomas Callahan out of the lobby, surrounded by heavily armed operators, the silence in the Belmont Presbyterian lobby was deafening. Sterling Price stood alone in the center of the room. His multi-million-dollar tour was ruined. His authority was shattered. And as one of the lead investors stepped forward, pulling out his phone to call the chairman of the board, Sterling realized that the firing he had so arrogantly declared earlier that morning was about to become his own. The heavy glass doors slid shut behind Commander Croft and his tactical team, sealing the chaotic storm of the outside world away from the pristine, echoing lobby of the Belmont Presbyterian Medical Center. But the damage inside was already done. The silence that followed the screech of the departing Suburbans was thick, suffocating, and loaded with the kind of tension that ruins careers. Sterling Price stood frozen in the center of the lobby, his tailored suit feeling suddenly like a straitjacket. He looked frantically at the faces surrounding him. The sycophantic smiles of his staff were gone, replaced by expressions of thinly veiled disgust. The security guards, whom he had ordered to lay hands on a life-saving nurse, wouldn't even meet his eye. But it was the faces of the investors that sealed his fate. Arthur Kensington, a billionaire telecommunications magnate and the anchor of the $50 million endowment Sterling had been desperately courting, stepped forward. Kensington was an older man, leaning heavily on a silver-tipped cane, his expression carved from absolute ice. "Arthur, please," Sterling stammered, holding up his hands in a placating gesture, his voice betraying a desperate tremor. "I assure you this was an isolated incident. The breakdown in protocol." "The only breakdown in protocol I witnessed today, Mr. Price, was your catastrophic failure of basic human decency," Kensington interrupted, his voice echoing sharply off the Italian marble. Sterling blanched. "Arthur, the man looked like a vagrant. He was a security risk. We have a standard to maintain for our elite clientele." Kensington struck his cane against the floor, the sharp crack making Sterling flinch. "My youngest son did 2 tours in Helmand Province with the Marine Corps. He came back looking a lot worse than the man who just bled on your floor. You looked at a dying hero and saw a nuisance. You looked at a brilliant, dedicated nurse fighting for his life, and you saw a PR liability." Kensington pulled his platinum smartphone from his breast pocket and tapped a single number. He held the phone to his ear, his eyes never leaving Sterling's pale, sweating face. "I am pulling my funding, Sterling. Every single cent," Kensington stated coldly, right as his call connected. "And I am advising the rest of the consortium to do the same. This hospital doesn't need a luxury renovation. It needs an exorcism." Kensington turned his back on the CEO and spoke into his phone. "Get my car, we are leaving." Panic, raw and unfiltered, seized Sterling. He lunged forward, grabbing Kensington's sleeve. "You can't do this. The board will crucify me. I brought this hospital into the black." Before Kensington could shake him off, Miller, the burly security supervisor, whom Sterling had ordered to assault Chloe just minutes prior, stepped in. Miller firmly clamped his massive hand onto Sterling's wrist, peeling the CEO's fingers away from the billionaire's jacket. "Mr. Price, I think you need to step back," Miller said, his tone devoid of any respect. "Unhand me, Miller. You work for me," Sterling shrieked, his composure completely shattering into a humiliating tantrum. "Actually, Sterling, he works for the hospital," Dr. Hayes said, stepping forward to stand beside the security chief. The chief of medicine pulled his own phone from his white coat. "And I'm currently on the line with Eleanor Vance, the chairman of the board of directors. She's been listening to this entire exchange on speakerphone." Sterling's eyes widened in sheer terror. He looked at the phone in Dr. Hayes's hand as if it were a live grenade. "Sterling," the crisp, authoritative voice of the chairwoman crackled through the phone's speaker. "Your primary mandate was to protect the integrity and reputation of this institution. In less than 20 minutes, you have threatened a federal operation, jeopardized our DoD grants, alienated our primary benefactors, and attempted to terminate our senior charge nurse for adhering to her Hippocratic oath. Your actions are a stain on this hospital." "Eleanor, let me explain. Save it for the lawyers," the chairwoman cut him off ruthlessly. "Your access to the executive suites is revoked, effective immediately. Your severance is frozen pending a full ethics investigation. Miller, escort Mr. Price off the premises. Do not let him stop at his office." The irony was heavy, poetic, and utterly devastating. Sterling Price, the man who had just tried to throw a dying veteran out like trash, was now being physically escorted towards the public exits by the very security team he had tried to weaponize. As Miller and another guard flanked the disgraced CEO and began marching him towards the sliding doors, Sterling looked back over his shoulder. He locked eyes with Chloe Montgomery. Chloe didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She just stood there, her scrubs stained with sweat and the blood of a Navy SEAL, clutching the matte black challenge coin Commander Croft had given her. She offered Sterling nothing but a look of profound, silent pity as he was shoved out into the cold Chicago morning, stripped of his power, his dignity, and his career. The fallout from the lobby code blue did not just ripple through the sterile, polished corridors of Belmont Presbyterian Medical Center. It hit the institution like a seismic shockwave. Within 48 hours, a junior phlebotomist's shaky cell phone video of the incident had bypassed internal hospital servers and landed directly on the front page of every major news outlet in Chicago. The footage was damning. The audio was worse. The world heard the sickening crunch of Chief Petty Officer Thomas Callahan's ribs breaking as Nurse Chloe Montgomery fought for his life, followed immediately by the shrill, arrogant shrieks of Sterling Price, demanding she abandon the vagrant. The public execution of the hospital's reputation was swift and merciless. For 2 weeks, the board of directors existed in a state of absolute, unmitigated panic. Arthur Kensington, true to his word, had completely frozen his $50 million endowment. Other high-profile donors, terrified of being associated with a facility that would willingly let a decorated Navy SEAL die on its floor for the sake of aesthetics, pulled their funding overnight. Chloe Montgomery, however, had continued to show up for her shifts. She worked her rotations in the trauma bay with the same stoic, unflappable precision she had always possessed. But the atmosphere around her had fundamentally shifted. The attending physicians who used to talk down to her now stepped aside when she walked down the hall. The nursing staff looked at her with a mixture of awe and fierce, protective loyalty. On a rainy Thursday afternoon, 14 days after the incident, Chloe was summoned to the executive suites on the top floor. She walked into the sprawling, glass-walled conference room, still wearing her navy blue scrubs, her stethoscope slung casually around her neck. Sitting at the massive mahogany table was Dr. Nathaniel Hayes, looking exhausted, and Margaret Higgins, the hospital's notoriously ruthless vice president of human resources. Margaret pushed a thick, cream-colored envelope across the polished wood toward Chloe. "Have a seat, Chloe," Margaret said, offering a smile that didn't quite reach her predatory eyes. "We want to formally apologize for the, unpleasantness you endured with our former CEO. The board has concluded its emergency session, and we are prepared to make this right." Chloe didn't sit. She glanced down at the envelope but didn't touch it. "Make it right how, Margaret?" "By recognizing your exceptional leadership under fire," Margaret replied smoothly, tapping her manicured fingernail against the envelope. "Inside that folder is a contract for the position of Executive Director of Clinical Operations. It comes with a corner office, a parking space in the secured garage, and a base salary of $350,000 a year, plus performance bonuses. We want you to be the new face of Belmont Presbyterian's commitment to universal emergency care." Dr. Hayes looked down at his hands, clearly uncomfortable with the transactional nature of the meeting. He knew Chloe better than Margaret did. Chloe stared at the thick, lucrative contract. It was more money than she had ever seen in her life. It was generational wealth for a nurse. It was the ultimate corporate olive branch. Slowly, Chloe reached out. But instead of picking up the envelope, she unclipped her heavy plastic security badge from the collar of her scrubs. She placed it squarely on top of the contract. The loud clack of the plastic hitting the mahogany echoed in the silent room. Margaret's artificial smile faltered. "Chloe, I don't think you understand the magnitude of this offer." "I understand it perfectly, Margaret," Chloe said, her voice calm, level, and entirely devoid of intimidation. You don't want me to lead clinical operations. You want a human shield. You want to trot me out in front of the press corps on CNN and say, "Look, we promoted the hero nurse. We love veterans. Please give us our funding back." You want to buy my silence and my credibility to fix Sterling's mess. That is a highly cynical view of a very generous promotion, Margaret said, her tone hardening. It's a realistic view of a broken system, Chloe countered. She looked at Dr. Hayes, her expression softening just a fraction. Nathaniel, you're a good doctor. But this place, the marble floors, the VIP wings, the designer coffee in the lobby, it makes you forget what medicine actually is. You start treating net worths instead of nervous systems. I came here from Walter Reed because I thought I needed a break from the grit. But I'd rather work in the mud with people who actually care than in a palace with people who don't. Chloe turned her back on the furious HR executive and the multi-million-dollar view of the Chicago skyline. My locker will be cleaned out in 20 minutes. Mail me my final paycheck. Down in the staff locker room, the air smelled faintly of rubbing alcohol and industrial bleach. Chloe had a cardboard box resting on the small bench, quietly folding her extra scrubs and packing away her well-worn medical reference books. Jessica Lewis, clutching a clipboard to her chest, stood in the doorway, shaking her head in disbelief. I just heard from one of the executive assistants. You actually walked away from $350,000. Chloe, are you out of your mind? You could have bought a house in Aspen. Chloe smiled softly, tucking a framed photograph of her old medevac unit into the box. Jess, if I took that money, every time I looked in the mirror, I'd see Sterling Price looking back at me. I'm taking a senior charge position at the Westside VA hospital. Jessica groaned, rolling her eyes. The VA? Chloe, their budget is a disaster. The building is falling apart. The equipment is 10 years out of date, and you'll be working double shifts just to keep the ward afloat. Why would you do that to yourself? Because the men and women walking through those doors need me, Chloe said simply, zipping her duffel bag closed. They don't have PR teams. They don't have endowments. They just have us. Before Jessica could offer another protest, a heavy, rhythmic set of footsteps echoed down the linoleum hallway. It wasn't the soft squeak of rubber-soled nursing shoes, nor the sharp click of a doctor's loafers. It was the deliberate, authoritative strike of leather military dress shoes. A massive shadow fell over the frosted glass of the locker room door. Jessica instinctively stepped back as the door swung open. Standing in the threshold, completely filling the doorframe, was a man who commanded the very oxygen in the room. He was dressed in a pristine, perfectly tailored Navy service dress blue uniform. The deep, rich navy wool was immaculate. The gold rank insignia of a chief petty officer gleamed sharply on his sleeve. Above his left breast pocket rested a staggering rack of ribbons, the purple and white of the Purple Heart, the blue and white of the Navy Cross, and the Silver Star. But it was the heavy golden badge pinned directly above the ribbons that caught the fluorescent light. The eagle, globe, and anchor, clutched by a trident. The Budweiser, the mark of a United States Navy SEAL. He was clean-shaven now, his hair cut to a razor-sharp military regulation fade, but Chloe instantly recognized the broad, granite-carved jawline and the intense, piercing blue eyes. It was Thomas Grizzly Callahan. He didn't look like a dying vagrant anymore. He stood perfectly upright, an imposing monument of lethal discipline and sheer physical power. The only sign of his recent brush with death was a slight, guarded stiffness in his torso, a silent testament to the ribs Chloe had shattered to keep his heart pumping. Jessica gasped, her hands flying to her mouth, completely speechless. Thomas stepped into the locker room, removing his white combination cover and tucking it sharply under his left arm. He ignored Jessica completely, his eyes locked onto Chloe. His voice, when he spoke, was a deep, gravelly rumble, a far cry from the wet, desperate wheeze she had heard 2 weeks prior. They told me at the front desk you had just resigned, Thomas said, stepping closer. "I was worried I was going to have to track you down at your apartment. And Commander Croft advised against me doing that, seeing as it terrifies the locals." Chloe felt a sudden, unexpected lump form in her throat. She had saved countless trauma patients over her career, pulled them back from the very brink of the abyss, but it was incredibly rare to see them again, standing tall, whole, and alive. "Chief Callahan," Chloe breathed, stepping out from behind the bench. It is really good to see you standing under your own power. How is the chest?" Thomas let out a low, rumbling chuckle, immediately wincing and touching his sternum. "It feels like a freight train parked on my rib cage. The thoracic surgeons at Bethesda said you managed to crack 3 ribs cleanly off the sternum. They also said that if you hadn't hit me with that exact, brutal level of force, the neurotoxin would have completely liquefied my left ventricle before the medics ever arrived." "I owe you my life, Nurse Montgomery." He stepped forward and extended his large, heavily calloused right hand. Chloe took it. His grip was incredibly strong, warm, and distinctly alive. "I heard the audio file of what happened in that lobby," Thomas continued, his expression sobering. The warmth in his eyes vanished, replaced by a dark, fiercely protective intensity. "Commander Croft gave me the after-action report. You put your entire medical license, your career, and your freedom on the line to keep pumping my chest. You fought off a billionaire who was actively trying to let me die because I dirtied up his floor. You fought for me when I was completely out of the fight." "You would have done the exact same thing for any of your teammates, Chief," Chloe said softly, looking down at the gleaming golden trident on his chest. "I just did my job. I couldn't let you go." "No, ma'am," Thomas corrected gently, his voice thick with unshakable conviction. "Doing your job is checking a chart. Doing your job is pushing a med. What you did in that lobby, staring down power and wealth to protect the vulnerable, that was an act of absolute valor." He reached into the pocket of his dress uniform and pulled out a heavy, custom-crafted wooden presentation box. He opened it and placed it gently on top of Chloe's cardboard moving box. Inside, resting on dark blue velvet, was a heavy, custom-minted medallion forged from solid tungsten. On one side was the highly detailed emblem of SEAL Team 6. On the other side was the medical caduceus, intricately wrapped around a Navy anchor, with the date of the lobby code engraved beneath it. "My team had this struck specifically for you," Thomas said, looking Chloe dead in the eyes. "In our community, we don't give our respect easily. You have to bleed for it. You bled for me that day. You aren't just a civilian to us anymore, Chloe. You are part of the Brotherhood." He took a step back, his posture radiating immense respect. "If you ever need anything," Thomas vowed, his voice ringing with absolute certainty, "if you ever find yourself in a corner, no matter where you are in the world, no matter who is standing against you, you make a call, and we will bring the wrath of God down upon them. That is a promise from the teams." Chloe picked up the heavy tungsten medallion, her fingers tracing the cold, intricate metalwork. The sheer weight of the gift, and the profound meaning behind it, finally broke through her stoic exterior. A single tear escaped, sliding down her cheek, completely washing away the bitter, lingering taste of Belmont Presbyterian's corporate toxicity. She didn't need a corner office. She didn't need a multi-million-dollar view. This moment, the steady pulse beating strongly in the wrist of the warrior standing in front of her, and the unwavering, fierce loyalty of the most elite operators on the planet, was the absolute pinnacle of her calling. She looked up at Chief Callahan, her spine straightening, a fierce, proud, and brilliant smile breaking across her face. "Thank you, Grizzly," Chloe said, using his call sign, claiming the bond he had just offered. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a shift starting at the VA hospital in an hour. I have real patients waiting for me." Thomas smiled, a wide, genuine expression that lit up his battle-hardened face. He snapped his heels together with a sharp crack that echoed off the metal lockers and delivered a razor-sharp, painfully crisp salute to the trauma nurse who had refused to let him fade into the dark. Chloe Montgomery slung her duffel bag over her shoulder, picked up her box, and walked past him, stepping out of the ivory tower for the last time, and walking directly into the bright, unforgiving, and beautiful reality where she truly belonged. True heroism isn't found in tailored suits, corner offices, or the superficial prestige of a marble lobby. It is forged in the grueling, desperate moments when someone chooses to fight for a life that others have already written off. Nurse Chloe Montgomery risked her livelihood, her reputation, and her freedom to uphold her oath, proving that the value of a human being can never be measured by the clothes on their back. In a world obsessed with optics and profit, she stood as an immovable shield between a dying warrior and a callous corporate machine. The title of CEO commands obedience, but absolute courage commands respect, a respect that even the most elite operators in the world bowed to. If this story of unyielding courage and righteous justice made your heart pound, don't forget to hit that like button, share this video with a hero in your life, and subscribe for more incredible real-life dramas. Drop a comment below. What would you have done in Chloe's shoes?